right, good afternoon, welcome. Thank you for joining me here in the final breakout session slot. As the title implies, this is not going to be your average overview of deployment. We're going to dive pretty deep into configuration items related to Windows 10 deployment. So I assume you're not afraid of scripts, code, command prompts, other things related to deployment. I absolutely love questions. If you have any during the session, just yell the question. I'll be happy to answer. This is me. This is where I live. Well, not on the beach, but close to the beach in Sweden. I also have a second home in the US these days, so I go back and forth about once or twice per month, racking up a good number of frequent flyer miles. I'm on Twitter, Arwidmark, so if you do have questions, I will be happy to answer them over there as well. Or just send me an email. That works too. So if you tweet, tag the AppManagEvent and my alias, and I'll be able to actually find your tweet in the stream also. Now, I'll go back and forth a little bit in between MDT and ConfigManager throughout the session. These are the main deployment solutions out there for Windows 10 deployments. But the thing is, just because I demo something in, for example, MDT, it typically means that you can do the exact same thing in ConfigManager. It just doesn't make any sense for me to demonstrate the exact same thing twice, just because it's a different platform. And sometimes it's just faster to demonstrate in one of them. So let me just kick off a few of my VMs so we have something to play with. I just upgraded this guy last week to Server 2016. Or I should say I tried to upgrade my Server 2012 R2 demo box to Server 2016. But right now, this is only the evaluation media that is available. And you cannot do an in-place upgrade from RTM into an eval version. So it was more like a reinstall. But I use the same disk, obviously. But if you want to play around with it, it's available for download and test. It's pretty nice. There are some bugs to it, a few bugs, actually. One of them I found out recently is that sometimes when you go into VM full screen, there is no getting out of that full screen. So you have to sign out and connect back again. But that's why we do this. So, as I mentioned before, this is available for download, this demo environment. I mentioned that in my previous session. How many of you attended my previous session? A lot of you, thanks. I must have sent something right then since you're coming back. That's good. The environment is available for download. Go to my blog, search for hydration, and you can download these VMs, or rather a PowerShell script that will build these VMs for you. So this is a very convenient way to get a lab up and running quickly, and I will show you in a minute how to actually do that. I almost died earlier when I was laughing, not anything else. They were selling hydration or offering hydration juice out there in the expo area. So if you look at those containers, there are some tags, hydration use. And this is the keyword for automating installations. Microsoft has done this since 2007, providing you with kits that you can download that is a complete lab environment. So let's start there, because it's fun. If you go to my blog, as it says, and wait patiently, it's in Dallas, so it's a long way to here. Very long way. You search for hydration. You will find a bunch of kits. The one I'm using right now is for ConfigManager. This is for ConfigManager 15.11, which you very easily can upgrade it to 16.06 later. But there are other kits as well. So for example, here is one that builds the entire System Center suite. Tons of different VMs with the various components. DPM server, Ops Manager, Orchestrator, Service Manager, VMM, whatever you want to play around with, it builds. But this one, again, is for ConfigManager. So there are 3 steps to it. You download the kit. It's a massive zip file. I'm starting to hit the limit now of 200 kilobytes in that download. So it's quite small. It's a zip file with a PowerShell script in it and a bunch of containers. The reason I can keep it small when you download it, it's because it's an empty folder structure. It's a normal MDT deployment share. So you get this, but you don't get content. So you download, unpack, and then you copy files. The blog post will tell you exactly what to download, what to copy where, but this is typically where you download the trial version of whatever product it is, or you have the full media for whatever product it is. But think of it, even without the instructions on the blog, if you guys would have seen a folder named this, you probably would have copied the media from server into that folder. If you had seen a folder named SQL, maybe you would have copied SQL media to that folder. But again, the blog post will tell you what to download and where to copy it. So you download the kit, you copy some files back and forth, and then you simply open it up in the workbench. This is an MDT deployment share that has all these applications, that has these images, that has sequences, that builds lab environments. And then you just go here, you right-click, you generate a big, fat ISO file, a bootable ISO file. So if I look in the folder structure here, after running the upgrade, I get the big ISO file here, 20 gigs or 21 gigs. Then the only thing I need to do is to create a virtual machine. So I will create an app domain controller. I will store it somewhere. Generation 2, a bit of memory. Never ever, when you deploy VMs, configure them for dynamic memory. That's something you enable after you have deployed them, not during deployment. It will take 2 hours to install ConfigManager if it's dynamic memory. It takes 15 minutes when it's not. Give it a network, hard drive, and I will pick it to boot from that ISO. And also, if you look in that structure, there are PowerShell scripts that also builds these VMs. So I don't have to click around in the GUI that I did now. But this obviously also only works for Hyper-V. I did not provide any script for VMware. But again, it's a bootable ISO. I'm pretty sure you guys can figure out how to create a VM in VMware and boot it from an ISO. It's not that hard. But anyway, you create a VM, you boot it on the ISO in question, and then you wait patiently, and then you make a selection. What server would you like to build today? And you pick that server. I recommend starting with the domain controller, because all the other VMs is going to try to join the domain. And it's kind of difficult if you don't have a domain controller. So I click Enter. I will take a 22-minute break, because after 22 minutes, I have a domain controller with everything. I leave that VM running. I create a second VM. Boot it up on the same ISO, or select something else. And then after about an hour, I have a lab environment. So I've already done this. I already have a ton of VMs. But if I look into sequences, This is the sequence that builds my domain controller. In normal MDT sequence, that in the end installs DNS, Active Directory, DHCP creates a scope, creates some OUs and users, some subnets, install PKI if you want to play around with PKI. Basically just a sequence that does all this for you, fully automated. Same goes, I have a sequence that will install an MDT server if you want to play around with that. I have a sequence that actually installs a site server, ConfigManager. And again, it's a normal deployment, normal sequence, but in the end, I do more stuff. Add in components for config, Pixie, all the prereqs for IIS and bits and whatnot, ADK, install SQL, open firewall, set the memory, extend Active Directory, set permissions on the systems management container, and then install the site server. But again, it's an automated build. So there are no excuses for not having a lab and test environment. And if you leave this conference remembering only one thing and one thing only, I would like that to be that you guys are worthy of a nice solid state drive. So go home and tell your manager, him or her, that you need one. Because you can take any machine, and I mean any machine. You can take a 6-year-old ThinkPad, whoops, did not mean to do that, T420. It's a Core i5. It's a crap machine. Throw in 16 gigs of RAM because you can, even if the vendor say you cannot, you can. But then you put in a 1 terabyte SSD in it, or bigger. And this will be good enough to run a ConfigManager site server on because of the SSD. And if you can find better hardware, which you probably have already, it will be even faster. It is the solid state drive that does this. So even this really, really slow, very poor machine will, because of the SSD, outperform some of your servers. I guarantee it. Works, lab and test. Or you have a nice manager and you convince him to give you 4 terabyte SSD for a laptop. Took some convincing, though, I might add. But it's nice. Yes. So that's how you build an environment. Once you have one, you can start to use it for things. The first one is in the session this morning, I talked about how to create a Windows 10 reference image. I like to do that automated. So what I do, I spin up an MDT environment, light touch, and try to run it in full screen rather than part of the screen. So this is where I have it in my applications. Show you this morning. Adding in my images. I create my sequences that deploy, in this case, Windows 7, Windows 10. Normal sequence. But the default behavior when you do deployments in MDT, they look like this. You will create a VM. You will give it 4 gigs of RAM. You will give it 2 CPUs, because that will reduce the deployment time in half when you create reference images. Because the capture or creating a Vim file is actually quite CPU intensive. It's basically doing a zip archive when it creates the Vim. With 2 CPUs, you're good to go. So what I did on my blog was that I wrote a blog post a while back. So if you search for like a boss, there is a building reference images like a boss blog, where I've simply gathered tips and tricks to get reference images that time it takes to create them shorter. What you need to add, what you can do to speed up things. So that I've done already. So I booted on the ISO that I get from updating my deployment share. I get a list of sequences. So if I want to build a reference image of Windows 10, I will select Windows 10, click Next, select where to store it when it's done. That folder, that file name, thank you. That's it. Now it goes ahead and builds this for me. But this wasn't very automated, was it? I still had to boot, I still have to select and click Next twice. It's almost automated, but not fully. How do I make it fully automated? If I ask you guys a questions during this session, and I will, and you don't know the answer, you can guess the word rules. Because the word rules in ConfigManager and MDT is the equivalent of this text file. This is, in fact, where you do most of the configurations for the deployments. So in this case, to automate it further, yes, you modify this text file. So if I go back to my server, I can reach that text file in two ways. One, I can double-click on properties on my deployment share and go to rules. That's my text file. Or I can find it in the file system on the right hard drive also. And simply open it in a notepad. Same text file. Just two different UIs to modify it. If I wanted to skip the questions about sequences, I will say yes, to skip that pane. And of course, then I need to actually apply, I need to tell it what sequence I wanted. If I want to skip the capture, I skip the capture. But of course, I need to tell it where I want it. So I added in these lines that will tell it to store it in that folder and name it after month, date, year also. And since I automate everything, the only thing I need to do now is figure out a way to start the virtual machine and boot it on an ISO. PowerShell. I showed you this demo this morning, but I didn't show you the script. I was saving this for this session. So if I open up a prompt here, that's the wrong folder. You can download this very complex script on my blog. I worked hard with it. It's probably 12 lines, at least. Oh, 23 lines, whatever. This is just a script that builds a VM. Mounts it on an ISO, boots it, loops until it's done, and then deletes it. So again, if I need a new reference image, I run the script. Take a break. After an hour, I have a Vim file on my server that in this scenario, in fact, does have a few applications in it. It will be a Windows 10 image with .NET Framework 3.5 in it, added, with all the runtimes needed for C++. In this case, I also added in Office to it. It will run Windows Update as many times as needed, patching both Windows and, in this case, runtimes and Office. And then in the very end, it will sysprep and capture it for me. Again, fully automated. This concept is called Image Factory, automating the build of reference images. And I have a good friend back in Sweden, Mr. Michael Nyström, partner in crime. He has an even shinier PowerShell script on his blog. His blog is Deployment Bunny. Not kidding, that's the name of the blog. TLS something. Here we go. If you search for image factory, you can download a PowerShell script that is more intense. What that script will do is almost the same as this one. I killed it, so it didn't like it. But this one will loop through your sequences that you have. I have 2 Windows 10, I have 2 Windows 7, I have 1 server 2012, 1 server 2016, and it will build an image for each. So if I would run this against this deployment share, I will have 6 images. But again, it's fully automated. That's the concept of an image factory. Very, very nice. And just to prove a point here, there is a reason why it's called the deployment bunny. See where I put that one, maybe here. This is from a conference earlier this year. He actually showed up in a bunny suit. Very cute. Sidebar. So that was creating a reference image. Once you have one, well, you would like to deploy it, right? And I got a question during the break, what should we use to deploy it with? Should we use MDT or should we use ConfigManager? Very easy. If you have ConfigManager, use it for deployment of that image. Don't use it to create it, but use it to deploy it into production to your X 100,000, 10,000 machines. If you do not have ConfigManager, you use the free standalone MDT toolkit that you can download and play around with. They support the same feature for OS deployment. And if your goal in life is only to deploy Windows 10, you are wasting your money so much by using ConfigManager for it. That's not why you buy ConfigManager. Not for deployment only. You buy it because you want to manage the machines afterwards also. That's why you buy a management platform. And if you have one that you bought for that purpose, yes, you should also use it to deploy Windows with it. But if you only want to apply an image to a box, just use MDT. Don't worry about ConfigManager. ConfigManager is when you want to have the whole thing running. But you need to be on these versions to be fully supported by Microsoft for the 1607 anniversary edition of Windows 10. And yes, you will have to be somewhat current. Microsoft is really stepping up the cadence on things. You don't have to upgrade every single time, but you have to do it every now and then. The first release of Windows 10 will expire in 3 months. And when expire, I mean you don't get any more updates to it. It obviously will work still. ConfigManager, same thing. The newer version of ConfigManager will not support the older versions of Windows 10. So you need to follow along a little bit. Not every single release, but at least once a year, preferably twice a year. Upgrade, keep up to date. Do that as a sort of a routine in your organization, because it's less painful than having to wait 5 years like you did from XP to Windows 7 and then do everything at once and spend weeks and months in migration projects. Learn how to do it ongoing, and it's less painful for you. Now, often when you work with sequences for example, in ConfigManager, you often spend a lot of time doing it. Same goes for the MDT. This is where you spend a lot of time and a lot of hours configuring these. What happens if you accidentally delete one? Start with light touch. If you accidentally delete a sequence, or you have a coworker that just supposed to fix something, broke your sequence, how do you get it back? In Light Touch, it's so easy. It's in that folder. Each sequence have a folder in the control folder. The sequence is an XML file. Restore that from backup and you're good to go, assuming you have a backup. But that's something you should have, obviously. But what about ConfigManager? What if you do something stupid in ConfigManager? You have a sequence, you do something bad. How do you get it back? Steal my Coster script. Yes, that's a good comment. But if you don't have that, how do you get it back? You have to restore the entire site server. Is that a fun project on a Friday afternoon? No, it's not. So I recommend instead, steal with pride, borrow Mike's script. It's just a PowerShell script, really. This is not, the one I'm going to show you is not from Mike, but it does a similar thing. Let's see where I put it. It's a script that exports all my sequences. So here I have an empty folder. I run the script, and I have my sequences exported. I can do that in the console too. I can right-click and say export. It will take 45 minutes for each sequence if I have many packages to them. Using PowerShell, faster. About 5 seconds total for 13 sequences or whatever I had. So now I have a backup of my sequences here. And if I would do something really stupid, like deleting this one or any other of them, I can just create a new one from the backup. So I will use another PowerShell script, go to that folder, try to type it correctly, doesn't do very well. Let's see, this is a Windows 10 one. The package ID ends with a C. Try to remember that one. So I will import new sequence, specify the site code, PS1, specify the name. Sorry for deleting your sequence. And which file to actually restore. The C1. Enter. Go back to my console. I have 11 sequences. I will hit refresh. I will have 12. This is the restored sequence. And this is my full sequence. Smidge faster than restoring a site server backup. Less impact too. What my Coster did is an event handler, so that every time you do something in the console, like editing a sequence, it runs a script. Guess what that script does? Back up the file, appends a version number to them. So every time you or somebody else in your environment is editing a sequence, it automatically creates a backup copy. And you just saw how extremely difficult it was to restore a backup. It's pretty easy. So that's how you can work with sequences. And I also need another VM. I'm going to import that guy. What you also can do is you can create templates. In Light Touch, you simply copy them to your templates folder. You create a sequence that you modify and do, and you copy it to the template folder. The next time you create a new one, you can select that from a template. Same thing for ConfigManager. But where do you copy it in ConfigManager? You have done a sequence, you're happy with it, you exported it like I showed you, but when you want to create a new one, where do you need to copy it? Well, it turns out when you have the MDT integration, you install MDT in some folder, toolkit, templates, that's the wrong folder. There is an SSM folder. This is where you copy the SSM templates, ConfigManager. Because then when you go to the console and create a new sequence, you will have additional templates. This is one I've added beforehand. So you don't have to start from fresh every time. Very nice. Yes. Monitoring also. That's a feature that was introduced back in 4 or 5 years ago. It gives you real-time monitoring of deployments, both in Light Touch and ConfigManager, work exactly the same. So let me find a VM and boot it on something. So this is a Light Touch deployment. I will shortly log in. Password. Select the sequence. Give it a name, AME 008. Fine, start the deployment. Now I can go to my MDT server, open up the workbench, go to the monitoring node, and I will have my AME 8 running. So I will see them in real time. And I can also double-click it to get more details of my deployment, and I can also remote into it from any machine where I have the console installed. So if something happened in the WinPE phase, which actually is where most stuff will break for you, I can now press F8, get a command prompt, review the log files, whatever I need to do. While you are connected, it's breaking the keyboard on that machine. So this is the VM itself, or the physical box, whatever I'm deploying. I can't type anything here. Nothing happens. It's locking that keyboard. It's not until you actually disconnect the remote session where I can start do things again. This is the same for MDT and ConfigManager. The component that makes remoting possible is Dart from MDOP, the desktop optimization pack. As of August 1st last year, if you guys bought a software assurance subscription or renewed a software assurance subscription with Microsoft, you now have MDOP included. Prior to August 1st, you had to buy it as a separate license. Now it's included. So, okay, cool. How do you add that to your boot image? It's not that difficult. In Light Touch, it's a checkbox on your deployment chair. Dart, thank you. In ConfigManager, it's a checkbox when you create your boot image. You just need to have install Dart on the box first and copy 2 files. It's well explained in the documentation. But that's it. And then you get remote capabilities. It's fantastic when you have a machine that is far away, different city, different country, whatever, and you need to troubleshoot it. Very convenient. Other things around ConfigManager and MDT deployments is when you have, say that you are installing applications using a wrapper. Say that you have written a script that you would like to debug, would like to test. In ConfigManager, that can be extremely painful unless you trick it. How do you install a wrapper? Well, I create a package or app in ConfigManager. I distribute it to my distribution points. I deploy it. I wait until policies are created. I go to a client, I update the client, and I wait, and then I can try my script. Oh, crap, something was wrong in my script. It was a typo. Change the script, update the content, wait, try again on the client. Each iteration will take like 10 minutes. But what you can do, and I have this on my blog as well, you can create a very small sequence that doesn't do much, but it does open up a command prompt using a component from MDT called Service UI and runs it. Now the sequence aborts in the middle, it takes a break and gives you a command prompt. At that time, you can run the script as many times as you like. Run it, change it, run it, change it, until you nail it. Then you can update your package. And that will save you a lot of time when working with scripts in ConfigManager. The only thing you need to remember, really, is Service UI and my last name, because if you Google or Bing that, you'll find a blog post that explains how this works. Quite easy. So once you have everything in place, once you know how to deploy Windows 10 drivers and apps and whatever, you typically worry about how to assign settings. And for example, you can integrate with the MDT database. To give an example what that looks like, this is a database where you can add in, for example, roles. So I have a role here for marketing in the US. And if you belong to the marketing in the US, you're supposed to have a specific OU. Machines are supposed to be in a specific OU. You should maybe have some specific ConfigManager apps or some ConfigManager applications, legacy packages. So a role is just a group of settings. Deployment settings, app settings, packages, whatever. And then when you add your machines to it, you can simply assign them one or more roles. That's a very convenient way of grouping settings together. And of course, you can add machine settings also, like a computer name. So you can pre-stage machines into the database, and when I deploy a machine with this serial number in this case, it will get the settings from the computer entry and get more settings and apps from the role it belongs to. And what you then can do is you can take this one step further and combine this with web services. Code that is running server-side, both MDT and ConfigManager, that lists information for you. So as an example, on CodePlex, I have a project called Pretty Good Frontend. It's including source code. Yeah, come on. Here we go. It's the MDT Light Touch Wizard that I'm using with ConfigManager. But in the back end, I have web services reaching into Active Directory to give me a list of available OUs in real time. I have another web service or a method reaching into ConfigManager to give me available sequences. Now I can combine this with logon information to say if I'm logging in, I'm supposed to see the following sequences. If somebody else from help desk is logging in, they should see the other sequences. So you can basically customize this to your heart content. This is just an HTA, but running web service in the backend to receive information from ConfigManager. So it's you guys that decides the level of automation in these systems. And what I love about these platforms, they are so open, you can customize and do anything you like with them. This is obviously code that you have to develop and use, or you steal with pride, you use something else. So that Custard person I talked about before, I actually met up with him a few years ago. Did not mean to go there. But we put together a book, Stealing with Pride, pirate ship, of course, which is a book on how you develop, script, create solutions like this for both MDT and for ConfigManager. So 400-some pages, tons of sample scripts and things. So if you want to dive in more, that's a good resource. For those of you that has an Amazon Prime account, it's available in their library for Kindle for free. And free is a good price. So with that, I'm out of here. Thank you, guys.